Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So greetings and welcome, Chris. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I do always like to ask my guests something about their origin stories. So it would be useful to know, in your own words, what you studied at university, and was it inevitable you'd end up in foreign affairs and this focus on China that you've had over your career up until now?
Yeah, far from inevitable, I guess I'd say that first. But yeah, I mean, I was in undergraduate studies, I focused on history and political science. And like most people doing that, if you don't know what you're going to do with your life, there's an assumption you'll wind up going to law school, which was sort of my plan. And I got deep into my junior year at university and started to look at the law school curriculum, right? And I was thinking, 3 years of torts? I don't think so. And so I started thinking, well, maybe I'll go to graduate school. And it was funny, when I was a young person in American high school, I was my local congressman had a program where he would take two students from each school in his district or in his that he overseed as his representative space, to Washington, D.C. for sort of a 2-week program. And I remember finding that very exciting. You know, we were able to go on the floor of the Congress and see the Supreme Court and all of that. And I always had this interest in sort of foreign affairs or at least international stuff. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go work for the government. And if I'm going to do that, I should go to DC, for my continuing studies. So I did that. I went to George Washington University, and they had a very specific program in what's called security policy studies. So it was focused for people who are interested in working in the intelligence and national security community. I'll be honest, I had no particular desire to work for CIA. It was kind of a fluke, really. They had I went to a career fair at the university. They had a table. I sort of dropped a resume with them as sort of a lark, really. And I thought I'd never hear from them again. And, some series of white envelopes later, I was asked to go out for interviews, and I did that. And this was the early 90s. And so like most people in international relations, very few people were focused on China. They'd just come out of the Tiananmen crackdown. Soviet Union had collapsed. It was not looking good, for the Chinese Communist Party. And at that time in the American public education system, we didn't talk that much about Asia. You learned a lot about Europe and US history, but not much about Asia. So I was sort of a novice. So when I went there for interviews, at that time, I was focusing mainly on post-Soviet Union and Middle East things. And so I saw those two offices naturally. And then they sort of said, we're going to go to see China now. And I'm like, China? I don't know anything about China. They said, well, they want to talk to you. So it turned out, they were interested in having someone look at Chinese civil military relations. And I had done some work on civil military relations in communist systems. And so that was sort of a natural fit. And I went home, and, they called several days later, and they said, the good news is, like, all 3 offices want to hire you, so you get to choose. And so I thought, I'm going to try this China thing. And
okay, well,
I sort of fell in love with it. And so a bit of serendipity there for sure. And I fell in love with it, and I've been doing it ever since. So,
and of course, I mean, so you joined the CIA in the 90s then.
Yes, correct.
And presumably that period, again, that wasn't really a big focus, for the US.
No, not at the beginning.
It was still like it was the end of the Cold War.
That's right.
It was kind of the end of history sort of phase. It felt like there's retrenchment. Obviously, there was certain conflicts in Europe. There was the Bosnia, I suppose. There was, I guess Iraq War I. There were mostly these sorts of conflicts, but it didn't feel existential like the Cold War.
No, that's right. And in an eerie sort of, analog to what we're seeing now, although with less drama. I was hired in what's called the peace dividend, period, right? And so CIA hired very few analysts at that time, because they thought, hey, we're done with this now. And, they remained obviously heavily imbalanced, I would say, toward Russia and Soviet Union, even long after it collapsed. So China, the office I worked in, remained very small until probably the mid-90s, and then started to grow after that in importance and focus.
And just for my personal sort of gratification, I mean, what does working for the CIA entail? I mean, we see it in the movies all the time, and it seems like
It's not that.
you end up going from a desk job, one moment, the next day you get flown in Jack Ryan style into some conflict zone, and you take on
Yeah.
the baddies. But
Yes.
what's actually like to work?
Yeah, well, it's an exciting occupation. I was on the analytics side of the house, so no James Bond activity for me, but even Jack Ryan is a bit of a myth. I've never jumped into submarines or anything like. Oftentimes, on our side of the house, we worry about paper cuts and whether the printer has toner. Things like that. But all kidding aside, obviously I was involved in some very cool things while I was there. So it's a great occupation. The day-to-day of it is really focused on serving what we call the first customer, which is the President of the United States, and the President's daily brief. That is the sort of be all and end all, the kind of daily intelligence newspaper that the President receives every day. So as an analyst, right from when you come in the morning, you're reviewing all the information that's coming overnight and sort of asking yourself the question, do I have anything that should be written for the president today? That's really the primary focus of analysts. And when you're not doing that, you're doing briefings downtown for senior, policymakers, or you're engaged in exchanges with liaison partners overseas, things like that. So.
Okay, great. Now, I mean, moving on to the US-China relations, I mean, I don't know what's the right point to start in terms of the evolution of US-China relations. But maybe actually we could start with the Obama period. So, I mean, simplistically, we had kind of the trade phase, WTO and so on. Then it seemed like under Obama there was this Asia pivot.
Yes.
It seemed,
or an attempted an Asia pivot.
Attempted, at least the words were used.
Yes.
So there seemed to be this build up towards, okay, China is the new is a threat to the US in a broader sense now. In your own words, how would you just sort of describe the evolution of US relations with China, say from Obama, Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2 now?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the Obama administration is interesting, and they're often tarred unfairly, in my opinion, for the kind of who lost China discussion, or that they were overly naive, about Xi Jinping and China's ambitions and so on. I don't think that's the case, having interacted closely with that administration and the president himself and some of the key players in that administration. My sense is they were fully aware, of the direction things were going. I think it's fair to say there was a reluctance to believe that, and we saw this mirrored in the academic community on China as well, that Xi Jinping was somehow a different animal, and would change fundamentally the collective leadership that had, sort of dominated the Chinese political system from the early 1980s onward, really. And that I think people were slow to come to. But in terms of skepticism around Chinese activities in the South China Sea, cyber, et cetera. I think, if there was a failing, it was a lack of willingness to believe that Xi Jinping was a risk taker, right? And was somebody who might act very, sort of unsurprisingly in various ways. And also that he just wasn't honest. I mean, obviously, he promised President Obama he wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. They signed an agreement about cyber intrusions, and so on. And neither of them were worth the paper they were written on fairly quickly thereafter. So I think that, that skepticism then started to build, and thoughts about are we going in a different direction with this relationship? And then, of course, when Trump 1.0 came in, then you saw, I would argue, a fundamental break with what had been 40 years of precedent in terms of the relationship, the reframing of China as a strategic competitor and basically an adversary of the United States, largely focused in the trade space. But as the administration went on, then we got more movement in the security and sort of anti-regime and Chinese regime sentiment, democracy promotion, human rights, these sort of things really came into fore toward the end of the administration. They did a lot of things that would have been unprecedented, or were unprecedented in that preceding 40-year period. And so that reframing was fundamental, I think, and people were slow to sort of accept the wisdom of it and so on. There's a lot of skepticism, but now it's seen as basically standard, right?
And Biden continued those policies essentially.
Yeah, I would say Biden largely Xeroxed Trump's China policy, if in a more, touchy-feely or easygoing way. And, to his credit, wanted to stabilize the relationship because it was heading in a steep downward spiral, at the end of the Trump administration, and that kind of continued in Biden with the balloon incident, and things like that. But then the president, went on a very serious campaign to try to stabilize the relationship, do have some dialogue with him. I think, to the degree the Biden administration made some mistakes, it was very early in terms of a couple of things. One, I personally felt that the framing of the relationship as democracy versus autocracy was not smart. It limited the US's freedom of action in a lot of ways, and also perhaps incentivized us to do certain things with various countries, including Taiwan, just simply because they're a democracy, whether it was in the U.S. national interest or not. I think the second mistake was to adopt a policy that was sort of a three-legged stool at the beginning of the Biden administration, which was domestic strengthening, bringing reshoring manufacturing, those sort of things. Totally smart, makes sense. You have to do that. Obviously, deepening relationships with allies and partners, also, very smart. But then don't talk to the Chinese under any circumstances while you're doing those first two things. And I think they learned, it took them an awfully long while, in my opinion, that ultimately China's just too big and too influential in the global system to ignore. And really, by the time they figured out you can't ignore them and started talking to them, suddenly I think they found themselves making concessions that they might otherwise not have if they had been speaking to them from the beginning. So I think that was a mistake. And then, certainly in the world of export controls, they outdid Trump one. They did some things that Matt Pottinger and other, China hawks from the first Trump administration could have only dreamed about in terms of export controls and so on. So I think, they certainly get an A for that. I'm sure we'll discuss DeepSeek and all that later, but there's a real debate on, I think, in DC now, though, whether those export controls have been effective, or how effective they've been, and how they should be adjusted going forward. And in terms of Trump 2.0, it's early days, so we don't know what it's going to look like. But you get the sense, anyway, that there's less immediate focus on just going hammer and tongs, against the Chinese. Obviously, we didn't see 60% tariffs on day one. We didn't see them a few days ago when we got the 10%. So it's sort of a go slow. And there's a strong sense that President Trump has a certain amount of ambition, with regard to what he'd like to do with this relationship. So I think it's a different space. The Harvard scholar Graham Allison had an interesting op-ed a day or two ago, I think in the Washington Post, sort of saying Trump could end up doing another Kissinger. I think that's a little overwrought, probably because of the structural challenges in the relationship. But we just don't know, which direction Trump's going to go. And I think what I find most intriguing is that the true hawks in the ideological sense of the Chinese Communist Party is an evil regime and should be ended, such as Matt Pottinger and Mike Pompeo and so on, those guys aren't in this administration. And I think that's deliberate.
Okay. And I mean, one criticism of Trump in relation to China is that he is so focused on trade, he misses out on all the other aspects of the China relationships, whether it's geosecurity, cyber, all of these other sorts of issues. I mean, do you think that's a fair critique of him?
I think it can be. I mean, he's definitely very obsessed with trade balances. There's no doubt about that. That's the thing that motivates him the most. I think, he displayed, it's kind of difficult, right, with Trump, because you would think, based on how uncertain, he can be and how volatile, that pattern, and he kind of defies pattern analysis. But I think he does have certain patterns that he returns to on a regular basis, and certain framings. It's hyperbolic, but I like to say in some ways his brain sort of stopped working in 1986. He had sort of a framing of the world and trade and so on at that time that still is very palpable for him. So, but I do think there's a pattern that was clear in Trump 1, which is that as long as he feels there is something to be had where his, art of the deal mastery can come up with something amazing, then he's interested and he's engaged. And he generally kept the hawks in the administration at bay, during that time. But the minute it starts to get difficult or bogged down or, pick your adjective, then we tended to see him at best just sort of turn it over to the working level people to continue, and at worst unleash the hawks in a very, destructive way. And I would expect that pattern to continue. And so I think, right now it seems that within the administration, most of the hawks are located at the National Security Council. Obviously, Secretary of State Rubio has very strong views about China. And my guess is they will be, again, sort of kept in a box, for a period while we see what is doable and what isn't. And if he gets dissatisfied, then I think we'll see real trouble in the bilateral relationship. And you can see them even on the, sticking with the trade stuff, you can see them, I would call it loading the gun, right, with this America First trade policy memo that the administration released, where they're going to investigate everything under the sun, pretty much with the trade relationship with China, and it'll all be there ready, to be used if by April 1st, President Trump is not happy with how things are going.
And I guess it might be worth sort of stepping back and thinking about this more sort of almost theoretically in terms of international relations, around this whole notion of the Thucydides trap, and having a sort of a geopolitical rival that's also an economic partner as well, which is obviously very different from the Cold War. So, I'm almost kind of trying to ask is, what is the right thing America should be trying to do with China so that we can then benchmark policy to that? What do you do with an adversary? Or is China an adversary? Is this the correct language to use? With a rival like China.
Personally, I don't think we should be describing them as an adversary. I think rival is fair, and I think the Chinese would say, yes, we're rivals, and you don't, some of the work that Matt Pottinger and his ilk have done in this space, I think is very useful in the sense of you don't have to guess, as to what Xi Jinping thinks about America. It's published in a lot of his speeches and so on. In other words, you don't need secret intelligence to tell you what he's thinking, and the framing is pretty clear, right? Which is that the U.S. is a power that's in decline, but one that is seeking very hard to prevent China from reestablishing its place of at least parity, as a major power, if not superior to the United States in the global system. And as such, this is a competition stroke conflict. And, Xi Jinping is of the view that China's socialist system will triumph, in this contest, and that U.S. will be unraveled by its various contradictions. So there's no surprise there. So, my sense is it's perfectly reasonable, to describe them as a competitor, certainly, and a rival. In terms of, how we should think about the relationship, I have tremendous sympathy for the people in any administration trying to manage it, because it's massive and complex. And as I said earlier, and as you pointed out, I would argue in the economic area, certainly, and also in the typical, things that people talk about, security relationship, technology, cyber, all of that, there are certain structural tensions in the relationship that are very hard to resolve, as long as you have this sort of different framing of how the world looks. And so you have to think about that. In terms of how it should be managed, my simple formula, which is grossly oversimplified, is, most administrations, we kind of did a review of administrations there. They do the first part of the equation well, which is to come into office and say, okay, let's do what in government we would call a rack and stack of China's global ambitions. What do they want? And the government's very good at making those assessments, right? And then the hard part is the second stage, though, which I've not seen any of the recent administrations do, which is to then say, okay, and of those global ambitions, which of them can we accept? And they don't do that because it's hard to do it politically, right? And yet you have to accept some of their global ambitions because they're just too large, right? And so my view is that would help us have a much more focused China strategy if we said, okay, we're going to accept the ambitions in this space, but not over here where our fundamental national interests are. And instead, the signal we send to them constantly is we don't accept any of your global ambitions, period. And so therefore the relationship can't remain stable under those conditions. And I just want to be clear, I'm not letting the Chinese off the hook. Xi Jinping would have to change a lot of his viewpoints as well, in order to do his part of that bargain.
And You mentioned President Xi a number of times. I mean, I mean, is his view, or actually, first of all, I mean, is it his view that's driving everything in China? I mean, let's look into
Yes.
the mind of the Chinese. Is it him or is it the party?
It's him.
It's him.
I
Okay.
mean, I think it's fair to say that a lot of these trend lines were already, in the running, if you will, in the Chinese Communist Party's thinking as China started to rise as a serious power. We saw elements, leanings, the beginnings, whatever you want to call it, of a lot of these policies in the late Hu Jintao period, the leader who preceded, Xi Jinping. But the way I like to frame it is that in the same way that President Trump was an accelerant for, the deterioration in the relationship, Xi Jinping has been an accelerant as well, with his particular views. And in terms of what drives policy right now, it's all Xi Jinping. There's really no other views. I do think, though, that it was naive of a lot of scholars and people in government and so on in that earlier period to believe that the party might be on some sort of journey toward a more open, more open and pragmatic style. I want to be fair. I don't think any of those folks were saying that, were kidding themselves. But they certainly thought that the party might stay in charge, but there would be a lot more room for civil society and competition in the party and so on. My own view has always been an institution like that can't abide that kind of development because it's a recipe to their own disaster. And we see Xi Jinping say that all the time, especially referring to this collapse of the Soviet Union, putting political opening before economic opening or trying to do them both at the same time, these kind of things.
Yeah, and in terms of how Xi views the relationship with the US, in terms of
Mhm.
the goals that China has to regain its position at top of the world, so to speak, does he view it as a zero-sum game that it has to be at the expense of the US, or does he view it as you can coexist with the US? So, I mean, what's his viewpoint in relation
Yeah,
to
I
zero sum versus positive sum?
Yeah, I think this is very an issue of high controversy in the China watching community. My own position is that it's not zero sum necessarily in his brain, but he does want the Chinese to be resuming their what he and the system, considers to be their rightful place as a major power globally. The way I like to put it is that the main goal is really when an actor in the region and maybe ultimately globally that might have a close relationship with the United States, when they're thinking of doing something that might roil the Chinese, or just be controversial, he wants them to think about what China might do at the same time they think about what the United States might do, and right now that's not yet the case, but he's trying to make sure that it is. That to me, that's it in a nutshell in terms of zero sum. I mean, my view is what he's doing is he's probing the US constantly, right? And he's trying to see what our red lines are. And we're not the best, it seems to me, in articulating those and certainly not in enforcing them. And, in Chinese culture, they only understand strength. If you don't push back, then they're going to take whatever you give them and go for another mile. It's very
Yeah.
common.
And how does Xi view Trump?
I think he's bewildered a bit by Trump. It's a sort of schizophrenic view. On the one hand, he realizes that, Trump is good for certain things, such as aiding and abetting China's U.S. in decline narrative, and look at the mess over there, and it's very helpful to their propaganda machine, generally speaking. On the other hand, he sees him as highly unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. And even if he believes that Trump, is sort of overseeing an acceleration in U.S. decline, it's sort of like a wounded animal, being especially dangerous. And the U.S. remains powerful, not just militarily, but economically and so on, and can hurt China, in a lot of different ways. I think, for example, my understanding has been that when President Xi went to Mar-a-Lago early in the previous administration, and he and President Trump are enjoying a piece of wonderful chocolate cake, as President Trump put it, and he whispers to him, "By the way, I'm bombing the crap out of Syria," and that made a real impression, I think, at the time on Xi Jinping, that this is someone who, can be volatile and unpredictable, and likewise the targeted killing of the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Force at the time, Soleimani, these sort of things that you would not see, I don't think, in a Biden administration, were made deep impressions on Xi Jinping. So I think at the same time, though, the view is, well, it's embarrassing how long it took us in the first administration, but we did eventually get this guy's number, which is that we just need to buy stuff, and he'll be satisfied, or at least say we'll buy stuff.
And actually, on that say we buy stuff, I mean, China didn't end up buying that
No,
stuff, and
no.
so what's the implications of that for Trump 2.0?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very interesting. And I mean, we see some evidence of it already, right, in this America First trade policy memo, where one of the action items is that the government should review the phase one trade agreement and how China did or didn't do. There's no real need to review it. We know exactly what they didn't do. And so, that's kind of that process of loading the gun, as I described earlier. What I think is interesting is that to what degree does Trump hold Xi accountable, for that, right? In other words, is he angry with him about it? And does he therefore want to punish, Xi Jinping for failing to deliver? Or is it rather he just sees it as an opportunity to renegotiate an even better deal, And I think my understanding is that during their phone call here just before the inauguration, they both were happy to blame President Biden for not having fulfilled, the phase one trade agreement. And so, there's an opportunity for them to be able to start afresh on that. But I think that and COVID, right, which Trump clearly blames for his failure to win re-election in 2020, how much does he hold that against Xi? My sense is it's water under the bridge, unless the Chinese disappoint him, and then we'll see.
And on China buying US goods, I mean, what are the goods that the Chinese could buy? Because obviously the US wants to push energy, and presumably China doesn't want to become reliant on US energy. So I mean, how do you think that would evolve?
Yeah, it's very tricky. And I like the way I was down in Washington the second half of last week, and I like the way someone I was speaking to put it, which is sort of like turning the Rubik's Cube, right? Trying to find how you get it solved, where the interests align, and and it passes the giggle test, right? Or the sniff test as a proper deal. It's difficult, right? And in terms of buying things, it's just not available, So like soybeans, there are no U.S. beans until, much later this year. And oh, by the way, China's completely, sort of change their supply chain on those to Brazil and to Russia to some degree and other countries. As you say, LNG is tricky because we have allies and partners who are going to be after that LNG. Prime Minister Shiba from Japan is in town and presumably will be making promises, to buy more U.S. LNG. Europe desperately wants our LNG. Perhaps there's enough to go around, but it's challenging. And then, typical manufactured goods like Boeing aircraft, the delivery timeline is, late 2020s at best. And do you really want to be buying Boeing aircraft right now? I think that's sort of an open question. So it's difficult to get there. And so you sort of say, and of course, the Chinese in any negotiation will say, we're happy to buy as many GPUs as you want to sell us, right? And things like that. So we'll see, how all that plays out. I think what struck me as interesting when I was down in Washington was a sort of sense of perhaps, at least theoretically, greater openness toward Chinese investment in the United States as a component of some kind of a deal, and how that would look. And, some people, I think, are of the view, which in my mind makes sense, Trump's so keen on reindustrialization in the US. And the reality is that Chinese firms in many cases have the leading technologies on a lot of industrial automation, and so on. And so would there be a possibility to encourage that into the US, and could they get something like that past Congress, and given the mood on the Hill about China?
I mean, how would Taiwan fit into all of this?
Well, that's the interesting piece. I mean, we're starting to see a lot more speculation, I guess we could call it, about a proper grand bargain. What has been interesting to me is that certainly from the Chinese mindset, prior to about a week ago or maybe 10 days ago, it seemed clear to me from my discussions there that, the leadership's view was basically a grand bargain wouldn't be very grand because, in critical areas like technology, like security, intelligence, whatever you want to call it, those structural tensions are so extreme, there's no deals to be had there. So it would be very narrow and focused on, economics and trade and so on. And then we started to see in the press and elsewhere a lot of musings, right, about what could China maybe do on Russia, Ukraine. And if they could do something there, what would they want to get in return? And it's Taiwan, right? And notions of what they call a fourth communique, so another U.S.-China, sort of highly authoritative document that would cover the U.S.'s position on Taiwan. And, the current position, of course, is that the United States does not support Taiwan independence. I think the Chinese would be fine with us upgrading that to we oppose Taiwan independence. And, I don't know authoritatively, but it seems perfectly rational to me that President Trump's view on that would be, it's just words. I don't care. I mean, he doesn't understand, I don't think, the complexity and the history of a lot of that, or at least the behavior of his first term team with regard to Taiwan suggested that they didn't understand it very well.
And in terms of potential retaliation by the Chinese against the US, so earlier we had the US imposition of 10% tariffs on China, and then China had a very limited response in terms of tariffs on a smaller section of goods. I mean, what are China's options here if things were to escalate between the two sides?
Yeah, well, it's a dilemma for them, I think, because they learned certain lessons in Trade War One, one of which was we can't go toe to toe with the US on tariffs because of the trade imbalance, right? And so we very quickly run out of things to tariff. And so we need tools other than tariffs to be able to respond. And we've seen them, I think it's fair to say, over the last 4 years, build up what I call their coercive retaliatory toolkit with various measures, a lot of which revolves around what is generally called lawfare, right? They've passed these various laws, the tariff law, the anti-foreign sanctions law, these sort of things to prepare themselves. And what I thought was interesting, I think in some ways their response, at least in the media and commentariat narrative, is being undersold a bit. Yes, the actions were modest, that's for sure. I think part of that is they wanted to save some room, for negotiation and to be able to escalate, obviously. But what I found striking was that we very deliberately, I'm sure, saw them use one element from each pot of this coercive toolkit, that they've been developing to show that they can, do so. So we saw critical mineral export, at least hypothetically, bans put in place. We saw the anti-monopoly investigation. We saw, these various the use of their unreliable entities list on PVH, the clothing company, and on Illumina in the biotech biopharma space. And in a lot of those actions from China, we can see very clear warning shots to the administration, right, in various ways. I personally feel the Google thing, while a long time coming, was meant to say, don't go after DeepSeek, or we'll take on your technology companies. And now there's rumor of potentially a similar investigation against Intel, the chip manufacturer, and even against Apple, right, who, very brilliantly, in my view, navigated Trump 1 and the tensions there and was able to sort of keep both sides satisfied and keep themselves largely out of the crosshairs. So I would expect to see, more action in that department. And the idea, which I think is very prominent in Washington right now, which is that China is on its back foot. They're very vulnerable because of the state of the economy, and therefore they're dying for a deal, and we can just hammer them, and they'll comply. I wouldn't underestimate Xi Jinping's willingness to fight back and in a significant way. And I think, if we look at the critical mineral stuff in particular, that's quite striking. I would argue for decades, the approach of at least the ministerial people in China who oversee that whole situation, the view has always been we keep the wizard very much behind the curtain, right, in terms of how dependent the world is on us, not only for these the mining of these rare earths and minerals, but the processing. Nobody else really wants to do the processing because it's a dirty and messy business. And I think that was an area where Xi Jinping fundamentally changed the viewpoint. And I think his view was basically, look, the West, or whatever you want to call it, the rest of the world, saw what we did to Japan in 2010 when we, engaged in a short ban of rare earth exports for a couple of months. And therefore, that should have been a signal to them. We better start diversifying. And they've done nothing. This is the sort of thought, or very little. And therefore, we shouldn't have any issues brandishing that weapon, and should use it.
And
And I
just
think that's
remind
very fundamental.
for our benefit, our listeners, what
Yeah.
happened with Japan thing in 2010.
Yeah, so at that time there was a dispute between an incident occurred where there was a clash between some Chinese sailors and Japanese sailors in contested waters. They have a territorial rivalry over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, and the Japanese arrested the Chinese sailors and held them, and that was China's retaliation to say, "Don't mess with us," and it was very effective at the time.
Yeah. And you mentioned sort of China's policy against Japan in that case. I mean, there's also the instance of China's interactions with Australia as well, which is another sort of template as well, which didn't necessarily go as well as China had hoped. So perhaps,
Not at all.
what can you learn from that? And perhaps you can sort of describe what that was, and then we'll
sure. So in a nutshell, the Australians had the audacity to suggest that there should be a look at what happened with COVID. What the origin was. Was it natural? Was it from a lab leak and these sort of things? And Australia also was beginning to push back quite fiercely on very clear efforts by the Chinese to influence their politics, their domestic discourse, the view of China, things like that. And the Australians eventually, sort of came to the view that we're not going to take this and we're going to push back. So the combination of those two things, the COVID and the sort of accusations of political interference, caused the Chinese to say, "We'll show you," right? And they put very severe economic sanctions on Australia. They stopped buying lobsters and wine and, a bunch of things. Of course, they didn't stop buying iron ore, which sort of gave Australia, I think, the room to maneuver. And also, kudos to the Biden administration on this. The Americans and other allies and partners of Australia did our best to rally around them, and to purchase more goods and, things like that to sort of push back on the term of art these days is Chinese economic coercion. And I think after a couple of years, of keeping, and by the way, they also, effectively kidnapped an Australian citizen, a journalist, who eventually was released. And so after a couple of years of this, the Chinese realized it basically failed, right? And that although Australia is a middle power, not a great power, maybe this doesn't always work. And I think we saw a similar episode with Japan over the whole issue of Fukushima and the release of nuclear wastewater, right? And so the Chinese used that as an excuse to pressure the Japanese not buy their seafood and things like that. And just very recently, we've seen them come as close as China can to a public apology, right, for that. Suddenly Chinese scientists have discovered the wastewater wasn't contaminated after all. And so, they're learning some lessons, I think, that these tools of theirs, which are powerful, don't always work, number one. And number two, I think this is an area where for China, or at least the Chinese Communist Party, this is an area where their sort of like dialectical materialism lets them down, right? Their view is it's all about economics. And we control the cards in terms of our big market and so on. And if we pressure people in that space, they'll cave. And turns out that's not always the case. Look at even small countries like Lithuania and Norway and, places like that.
And in terms of sort of pressures, we sort of touched on it earlier. There are internal weaknesses within China, and your sense is that people sometimes, in DC at least, could be overstating that as a constraint for Xi. But surely there is a problem within China in terms of its economy. The economic growth is relatively weak. They seem to be very reliant on exports. So, how is Xi viewed within China in relation to that? And what's his path forward out of that? Because it strikes me that a possible path out, I mean, this is obviously a Western perspective, is that you try to resuscitate the private sector, boost consumption,
stimulus, etc.
All the usual sort of list. And he seems to be the opposite of those things.
Yes. Well, I think in terms of the view, it's very difficult, obviously, to determine Chinese public opinion, right? Because There's no reliable polling done there. The Communist Party does its own clandestine polling in various ways of its population, and that's how they attempt to get a sense of public opinion. But obviously, talk to any entrepreneur or anyone who sort of did well in what Xi Jinping would describe as the bad old Wild West days of of the 90s and the early noughties. They're not happy, right? They're grim, they're upset, and same is true for your average Chinese who, their main asset, their home, has lost a lot of value, with the crackdown on the property sector and the effort to pop the property bubble. And there's a lot of uncertainty. They're not sure what direction the government's going in. And I think the biggest challenge they face, as you know well, is that confidence when lost is very hard to get back. And from a policy regime point of view, the government really needs to go over the top, in the opposite direction for a sustained period, right? Before people start to think, okay, I guess it's safe to, put a toe in the water again in terms of investment. And likewise, the various crackdowns on the technology sector, the education, private education sector, real estate. This has caused a lot of people to say, we just don't know when Xi Jinping, in the role of Zeus, is going to throw a thunderbolt in our direction. And even when he does things like say, okay, technology sector, you've learned your lesson. I love you again. It's still uncertain. And also, if you're a private sector technology developer or investor, you're seeing that the government's preference for certain types of hard tech, right? And also the use of these government guidance funds, which tend to favor SOEs, and so on, make it very difficult for you to feel comfortable it's time to invest. So in terms of how Xi Jinping is thinking about all of that, I think it's a constant battle for the economic technocrats that advise him to sort of tell him, look, boss, we get where you're going in terms of this, effort to turn the economic system away from the old, sort of export-driven, dirty, real estate-driven economy to this new shiny, advanced manufacturing and AI-enabled superpower. And we support the idea of that transition, but you have to remember you've got to keep enough gas in the plane in terms of economic growth along the way so that it doesn't crash, right? And it's funny when you talk to those technocrats, you might say when I was there recently, a piece of good economic news kind of was in the headlines, which that particular piece had not been good for some time. And so I was sort of telling my interlocutor, congratulations, like this is good news. And he was sort of saying, well, not really, in the sense of it makes it harder for us to convince Xi Jinping that more is needed if there's enough, in his mind, gas in the plane. And therefore the sacrifice, the end state, right, that he wants, which is to make China much more self-sufficient and resistant to U.S. ability and Western ability to pressurize them, in certain critical areas. That's worth, shaving off X% of growth. And so to simplify it, I think that the question I find myself asking for really the last several years is, what is the X in the economy that Xi Jinping pays attention to, right? And how bad does that X have to get before he'll change course? And I have seen several iterations in my own mind of what the X and how bad it can be, should be. Youth unemployment skyrocketing, for example, and concerns about social instability related to that and so on. And we don't see a change in policy. So I would say the closest we've gotten of recent, in my mind, was sort of last November, where the policies that were introduced in September, that got the market relatively excited, we were in the afterglow of that, still a little bit. And also there were a series of these what the Chinese have called revenge against society attacks, right? Where someone drove a car into a crowd of people, there was an attack at a school, things like that. And that tends to set off the regime's alarm bells in terms of social stability. But even then, it kind of petered out when the regime kind of went into overdrive to prevent those kind of things. So what I'm saying is, I think you need to have a situation where, there's several pillars of stability, if we want to call that, of the regime, economic growth, control, social, the security services, et cetera. I think we need to see wobbling of several of those pillars at one time to be enough to kind of provoke Xi Jinping to have a rethink. I mean, the reality is, if we look at the pattern of his decision making, he's a very stubborn guy, right? And when you talk to people inside the system, they will tell you that once he has set his stall out on a particular issue, it's very difficult to get him to change his mind. You either really have to wait until he decides to do so on his own, or some development or incident, not necessarily a crisis, gives the technocrats, new information with which to then go to him and sort of say, we need to change policies, see the end of zero COVID, and things like that.
Yeah. And you mentioned some of the technological goals, and we touched on DeepSeek earlier. So I mean, what is your view of DeepSeek and that as a representative of broader AI story within China versus the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's an important breakthrough, obviously. It's an interesting debate in this sense. We're going to have a technical debate, over how much of a breakthrough is it, how sustainable is it given export controls, in other words, okay, they made this breakthrough, but can they make the next, without a significantly larger number of GPUs accessible to them? I think it shows that this is a very dynamic field, and assumptions that the US can maintain a lead simply by denying Chinese access to the most advanced chips may not be true, and I think that's the shockwave, right? Now, again, there's that technical debate where people are going to say, well, of course they didn't spend $6 million. They spent $160 million. If you add up all the 50,000 GPU server farm and, all those things to the puzzle. And also that, of course, the CEO of DeepSeek has said this, of course, he'd rather have more chips than less, right? And so I think those in the kind of US technological ecosystem are trying to make this technical case, right? Which is that we don't have to worry that much about this. It's they kind of pantsed us, but we'll stay ahead. And then there's a government export control argument and the ecosystem around the government's export control enterprise that contractors and so on, whose cottage industry is to ensure that export controls are deepened and expanded. They're going to be saying, of course, this isn't evidence that it doesn't work, export controls. It's evidence that there have been too many loopholes. So my point is, I think DeepSeek, in terms of the policy implications of it in the United States anyway, it'll be the perfect foil for what I expect to be one of the early knife fights in the administration over this very issue of how effective or not these export controls have been in containing, China's ability to reach certain of these technologies. And, we have 120-day comment period already ticking along on Biden's AI diffusion order. And that's therefore where I would expect this DeepSeek debate to play out. What's interesting about President Trump's reaction to it so far is this is another pattern of his, right? Which is that when something like this happens, I would say if it was a more, traditional administration, say Biden or Obama or even, George W. Bush when he was around, it's sort of like, oh, they've surprised us. There's a freak out. We've got to go straight to more controls, things like that. Trump's approach to these things is usually good for them. Don't we suck? Or he's quick to blame the American side of it and to credit the Chinese. It's the same with things like some of the cyber intrusions, Salt Typhoon, Bolt Typhoon. I think his view is good for them. I mean, of course they're doing that. And shame on us if they were able to get in, and so it's a very different mindset in that respect.
And I just wanted to round off with a few points on some of the broader conflicts that are going on around the world. So obviously the Middle East, there's been a number of different sort of conflict areas. President Trump recently sort of talked about making some kind of US claim on Gaza and so on. China's has a response to that. But more generally, what is China's relationship with the Middle East? I mean, do they have a position on the various issues within the Middle East? I mean, who do they see as allies? Well, what's their relationship with the Middle East?
Yeah, so they have a very schizophrenic relationship with the Middle East, and I think it's part of it is it's evolving so much as their power and influence and thirst for Middle East products has increased, in recent decades. And so for the longest time, their approach was basically, we just want to be friends with everybody, in the Middle East. And number one, and number two, we're here to do business. We don't want to get involved in security matters or, any of that sort of stuff. And that's still largely their position, for the most part. Although we have seen them show greater interest. Obviously, their brokering of the Saudi-Iran diplomatic resumption of relations caught a lot of people, by surprise. The reality is, I think, to what little I understand about it, the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians wanted to do this anyway, and the Chinese were able to just sort of put a cherry on top and have a nice propaganda victory. And so, we don't yet see them fundamentally involved. And yet over time, they have had a very close and sort of non-public relationship with Israel at various times. And especially in terms of certain technological developments and so on. Obviously, they have sold weapons to Saudi Arabia. They've sold weapons to Iran for years. And so, they're a player in all those respects. I think where we're really seeing the shift is in the economic focus and a sense of key players in the region. The U.S. is not reliable at all. And oh, by the way, we have economic needs. I mean, I think it's fair to say, if you're MBS in Saudi Arabia, you're sort of thinking Trump wants $50, $60 a barrel oil. My economy is not in the best shape. I can't deliver that. And so I need a friend, and the friend is China, and I think things like the Gaza thing and so on, it's so disruptive. The Chinese will be there, to collect whatever benefits they can gain out of the rubble. Certain of their policies, of course, have roiled, certain parties in the Middle East. Obviously, their initial approach to the October 7th thing really frosted the relationship with Israel, obviously. And things like their refusal to condemn the Houthis and so on have upset certain other parties. So it's complicated, I guess, is the easiest way to say it. But their power and influence is growing there, I think. And the Middle Eastern states are increasingly buying into the kind of view of the Chinese that, okay, and we saw this, China has these things, the party has these things periodically called foreign affairs work conferences, and they happen every 5 years, roughly. Xi Jinping has increased the pace of them. And it's where the party sort of sets out its view of the global order and, future direction and trends and so on. And they had one in December of 2023, which got missed by a lot of people because it was very close to Christmas in the West. But they had a kind of key line in there, in which the formulation seemed to be sort of, well, the U.S. and Europe and so on, the West, quote unquote, is moving to deny us access to, certain things, and is putting a lot of trade restrictions on us and so on. So therefore, an India, parts of Asia, a global South, you add all those up, they equal one U.S. and one Europe, right? And I think they see the Middle Eastern countries, in particular, as playing a critical role in that piece. And, if you look at BRICS, for example, the China, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa agreement, the expansion of that, we see the Middle East countries coming in there and so on. And if you add them up and you add in, say, Turkey and so on, you're talking about a decent chunk of GDP globally, and more importantly, a very nice chunk of, very important things in an economic sense.
And how about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and China's role in that?
Yeah. I think they have, definitely, I found it odd when it all first sort of kicked off. People would say, especially China scholars, that China was straddling the fence, and it's a little hard to straddle the fence when 90% of your body is one side of the fence. So I think they have, obviously shown full support to Russia. There's been, the issues around dual use things that have been, propping up Russia's war machine. Obviously, financial transactions that help keep Russia afloat are something that the U.S. has been very concerned about. I think this is another area where I think the Biden administration blew it rather badly in their policy approach, in that I can't remember which year it was. I want to say sort of 2022, maybe. It was right around the time of the balloon episode, when, Secretary of State Blinken went to the Munich Security Conference and made a big deal about the Chinese are tipping over the line on providing direct military support to Russia. And the evidence just wasn't there. I mean, even our allies and partners were sort of like, well, we'll believe you if you have some evidence, but it doesn't appear that there is. So they succeeded in, sort of really irritating the Chinese with that performance. And then also there was no there there. So I think the US lost credibility then when it came further down the track to say we have evidence of dual use. The Chinese were able to say, well, here they go again, and so I think that was unfortunate. In terms of what the Chinese might be willing to do, my sense is that there's a lot of policy papers, heading in the direction of the Politburo on this. And the theme of which is sort of President Trump is saying a lot of stuff about us helping out on Russia, Ukraine. What could we do? And I think there you get a full range of suggestions from what I would call the highly performative, right? Which is that the Chinese would be willing to be a signatory to a ceasefire agreement or put peacekeepers on the ground, that sort of thing, to more substantive, what could we do? Could we, while not abandoning Russia, could we dial down the dual use support by 8% and the financial transactions by 12%, and it's something that's measurable that the US can see without fully abandoning the Russians and so on. So if you're Putin, you have to be a little concerned about this because, if the Chinese can get something on Taiwan, like a fourth communique, that's big for them, and something that they certainly would have to consider. So we'll see how it all plays out. I mean, I think the challenge, Bilal, right now is there's a lot of ambition, on this sort of stuff. And it feels to me that ambition, in some respects, like tariffs, is already colliding with reality. I think it's going to collide with reality on this situation as well.
Okay, well, on that note, I just wanted to round off with a couple of non-China related personal questions.
Sure.
One is we do have some younger people listening to the podcast as well who are at university, and what advice would you give to sort of youngsters as they sort of consider sort of entering the real world after their studies?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough one. I think, obviously hang in there. I guess as we discussed at the top of the program, never underestimate the power of serendipity. It's worked out pretty well for me in my career. In other words, I tell my sons this, you don't have to have your entire career map, at age 18. I think there's tremendous pressure on young people these days to have, their whole life mapped out, at a very young age. And the reality is you've got to get out there and explore and figure out what you're passionate about. I think that's the other piece is just do what you like, don't necessarily chase the dollars. And oftentimes if you're doing what you like, the dollars will come too. So, or the pounds in your case.
That's great advice. I do love reading books. I'm always looking for book recommendations.
Oh, me too. Yeah.
What are some of the books that have influenced you, or some books recently perhaps that you've liked?
Well, in terms of recent stuff I've read, there's an excellent one that I just finished in the China lane called The Great Transformation. I forget now at the top of it. It's Chen Jian, and I forget who the other author is. But it's a fascinating study of the period in China in the late 70s. Well, the run up to Mao's death, and then the other end of that up to I think it's about 1985. And it's just an era that's not studied that well. And they do an excellent job of sort of talking about all these contradictions. I think it's very relevant to today in terms of some of the arguments that are going on inside China. We are back in this sort of highly authoritarian semi-personality cult, type leadership. And, what are the debates going on about how appropriate that is and what might happen afterward and so on. So I found it really compelling, and it's a nice breezy read. It's not really written in an academic style. So I like that. I also, though, like to make a policy of not reading China in the few moments where I get, stuff that I can read just for me. So, something obviously part of having worked at CIA and so on, I've always enjoyed the Carre books, and especially the Carla trilogy. Those are some of my favorites. I think in terms of things, that it had an impact on me or something. When I was young, I read Suetonius's Life of the 12 Caesars, and that started a long-standing interest in Roman history. I was thinking about it regularly before it became cool on TikTok. And I guess that's it. I mean, the bottom line is I like to read a bunch of different stuff, because I just find many different sectors and things interesting. So, including good fiction.
That's fantastic. And so last thing is for our listeners, what's the best way for them to follow your work or reach out to you?
Just through my website, if they're interested in doing so, that'd be the way to contact me. Yeah. I do, I write publicly every now and again through my think tank hats. But my main gem is my consulting enterprise. So that's where I do most of my activity these days.
That's excellent. Thanks a lot, Chris. It's been super, super insightful, and keep up the great work.
Oh, thank you very much. Pleasure to be on.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.